Welcome to World Have Your Say. Well, all week the world's attention has been trained on the Syrian city of Homs, which we can see on some of the screens behind me here. And it's from there that the BBC's Paul Wood has sent a series of extraordinary reports. Well, Paul's now in Beirut and he's going to be joining us live to answer your questions about what he saw in Syria. We'll also discuss if the Chinese and the Russians deserve the vilification they've been receiving from many of you for vetoing that UN Security Council resolution. I know a lot of you like to tweet as you watch. We're using two hashtags today, the WHYS and the Syria hashtags. If you use either, the World Have Your Say team will pick up what you're saying, and of course we'll weave that into the discussion. Well, let me first of all introduce you to Amar Wakaf. He's a Syrian who lives in the UK. And Amar, you belong to a club in London. Just explain to us a little bit about what that club is and its view of what's happening in Syria.
Hi to you and to your audience. The Syrian Social Club was formed after the crisis began, and it basically comprises of the people in London, Syrians and British Syrians, who actually believe that entrusting the current government with reform rather than changing and toppling the current government is the safest and most sustainable and less costly way forward. There are quite a few issues at stake here. It's not only about political freedoms and so on and so forth, but also it's about the identity of the state. Certain minorities have certain concerns and so on and so forth. So we needed a sort of calm transition, and that's the idea around which the Syrian Social Club was formed.
Well, Amar, we appreciate you coming on. And those of you watching, if you want to speak to Amar or indeed any of our guests today, the number to call is country code 44 2070 83 72 72. We're putting guest questions to the BBC's Paul Wood and also discussing what now for the watching world now that that UN security resolution was scuppered by a veto by Russia and China. Let's bring in Rafif Jouejati, a Syrian American who has close ties with activists in Syria. Thanks for joining us. Tell us what your role is with the anti-Bashar al-Assad movement.
Thank you for having me. I represent the local coordinating committees in Syria. We are the activists on the ground who stage the daily protests and other forms of civil disobedience.
And what do you suggest the watching world should do now that that resolution has been vetoed?
Well, the Syrian people are asking for international support in really any form possible. There is a humanitarian disaster taking place in Syria. The regime has escalated violence against a civilian population, and Syrians are asking for assistance, whether that comes in the form of humanitarian corridors or foreign military intervention. They need help.
Amar, would you agree with that?
Well, I would certainly love to see the international community help or step in more proactively to help in solving the crisis in Syria. What the Western Hemisphere or Western international community is pretty much occupied with is more toppling of the regime, the stepping down of President Assad. But if we look at the issue from the Syrian population's interest point of view, perhaps a more proactive approach to bring in, to mediate talks between the Syrian opposition parties and the government, incubating the opposition parties as well, but at the same time sending signals of assurances to the Syrian government that we're not going to topple you. I think that would solve the situation much more than all the threatening and lecturing that we have been hearing for a while now.
And I wonder, Amar and Rafif, how do you feel towards Russia and China after it vetoed that resolution? I'm curious to hear you two discuss your emotions. Perhaps, Rafif, you could go ahead first.
Sure. The Russian and Chinese vetoes were essentially a slap in the face to a people that's under siege. The veto gave Bashar al-Assad a license to kill, so he has a green light to continue to shell residential areas in Homs, Daraa, the Damascus suburbs, and in fact all around the country.
Amar?
Right. I actually disagree a little bit with Rafif. I think we're easily in the West taking a moral high ground or assuming the moral high ground a little bit here. I think a lot of, like, at least 10,000 of Libyans would have probably wished that Russia had used or China had used their veto power when their country's issue was on the Security Council table. I think what is happening now with regards to restoring what I believe to be restoring government's authority on certain places has been stipulated by the President's speech about 4 weeks ago, in which he said, well, at a certain point of time we would need to restore order in certain cities. And if that's what's happening now in Homs, then perhaps that's his plan being carried out. This is with disregard to, I think, the deliberations in the Security Council.
Well, Amar and Rafif, let me bring one more person into our discussion, especially as we are talking about Russia. Evgeny Kozlov is a very well-known blogger in Moscow. He's got tens of thousands of followers on Twitter as well. Evgeny, good to have you on World Have Your Say. How do you feel about the role that your country is playing? Sergei Lavrov was in Syria this week. Is he getting it right on this crisis?
You know, I'm just recently arrived, and what I heard now from the news, actually, while I was traveling, that it's quite incredible reaction on Russia and China's support. It really, when I heard some New York Times and some other media, I found that they're very criticizing Russia and China about the support. So I don't know how this is related perfectly to Russian position yet. So I don't know exactly what Sergei Lavrov did this week in Syria, unfortunately.
Well, all three of you, thank you very much. We're going to carry on this discussion in about 20 minutes' time or so. And those of you watching, if you want to discuss not just China and Russia's role, but also how the international community should now proceed now that resolution has hit the rocks, by all means call us up, country code 44 2070 83 72 72, or you can tweet us using the WISE or the Syria hashtags. But for the moment, we're going to bring in the BBC's Paul Wood, who for the past few days has been sending a series of extraordinary reports from Homs. But Paul, thank you very much for joining us. You're now back in Beirut. Just tell us a little bit about the journey you had to take from Homs to Beirut.
Well, there is a movement of medicines and weapons in from Lebanon to Syria and of personnel out. It's an underground route, and I shouldn't perhaps go into too much detail, but Homs itself is virtually cut off, and we managed to slip out during a pause in the artillery bombardment. I think on the evening that we left, Tuesday evening, we were the only people to leave Homs, and when we got out a couple of miles outside the city, we found activists and fighters with the rebels, the Free Army as they call themselves, with crates of blood and fresh medical supplies, trying to get those supplies into the city and being unable to do so. As we were driven across the countryside, you form an impression that the army, the government forces have got the main roads, the big bases and the centre of the cities. But once you're out into the countryside, this is territory at least nominally controlled by the Free Army. I'm sure that if the government were to send tanks down the road, the kind of small checkpoints with half a dozen men would have to scatter. But it feels very much as if the Free Army are in control as you drive around. We did see one government checkpoint, and we were rather alarmed to be driven straight through it, but very revealingly our hosts told us they're still wearing the government uniform. They are apparently answering to the government, or that's what they want the impression to be, but they're with us. And this, I think, ultimately is the hope of the rebels, that the Syrian army will crumble from within. So far, though, that is not happening, and that is why Homs is being pounded even as we speak.
Well, Paul, many people have been getting in touch with questions for you about what you saw in Homs. Let's begin with a message from April, who's watching in Texas. She's posted on our Facebook page, and you've kind of touched on this already. She asks, how are people surviving right now in Homs? How are they getting food, water and medical supplies?
Well, things have been difficult in Homs for a long time. Remember, this is a divided city. There are some Alawite and Christian neighbourhoods which largely support the government, and Sunni neighbourhoods which largely support the uprising. So when we say Homs is being shelled, we mean that one half of Homs has got government tanks in it and artillery, and that is being used to shell the other half of Homs. Places like Bab Amra, where we are, have been virtually cut off for a long time, but things like food have been getting through. When the artillery started up at the weekend, things were more or less completely closed off. And I'll give you one example of that. Bread ran out on a Monday. And the man who usually drives the wounded very bravely decided to go and get bread from Haldia, a neighbouring part of the city that supports the revolution, the bakery in Homs, in Bab Amr having been destroyed. He had to drive across a junction which is often targeted with sniper fire. He managed to do it on that day, but on the following day he was hit with a sniper's bullet in his lower back, and we believe he has now died. So when it's that difficult to get the basics such as bread, then of course you can expect that things are running out now.
And we've got more questions on day-to-day life in Homs. This is from Sue, also on Facebook, wanting to ask you, are schools and shops still open, or is everyone hiding indoors?
No, you drive around, and we did very little of that, or you walk around and everything is shuttered. People are hiding, not in their basements, because there aren't basements in Homs. They're hiding in stairwells or in the middle rooms of houses. Shops are shuttered, schools aren't working. Everybody is just trying to stay off the streets, because those people who were killed were pretty much exclusively killed because they went out onto the streets. And there are things like airburst mortars being used, which spread fragmentation over a wide area, very, very lethal. Sometimes we saw casualties from people who were in their homes. You know, shells would crash through walls. They were using, I think, quite large caliber shells, and some of the injuries we saw were pretty horrific.
Paul, thank you for answering those two questions. We're going to take a short break now on World Have Your Say, but we'll come back and we'll be speaking to the BBC's Paul Wood. He's now in Beirut, but he spent most of the last week in Homs. Lots of you have been leaving messages at facebook.com/World Have Your Say. We'll get you some more answers from Paul in a couple of minutes' time. Well, let's quickly cross to Jill McGivering, who's with the World Have Your Say team, who are answering all of your calls. And Jill, we started off having a broader discussion about the international response to the situation in Syria. What's been coming in?
We're getting calls from India, Ghana and Nigeria. A lot of people simply expressing concern about the violence, anxious about what the next few days are going to bring, especially for civilians and, of course, especially in Homs. A lot of discussion as well about this wider issue of international intervention, with some people sounding quite frustrated that they feel more should be done to try and stop the bloodshed. Also, some people, though, sceptical about how useful international engagement will be, with some people saying it will be driven by self-interest and could even make the situation worse. And general concern about Syria's future. Justin in Arizona says Syria is in danger of becoming a failed state.
Hello, what have I say? Who am I speaking?
Indeed, and to all of you watching, please do keep your calls coming in. The BBC's Paul Wood has spent most of the last week reporting from Homs in Syria. He's now in Beirut, and he's joining us from the BBC Bureau there to answer many of the questions that you have about what he saw in Homs. And Paul, one of our guests on today's World Have Your Say is Amar. He's a Syrian who lives in the south of England. And Amar, I'm sure you've got a question for Paul.
Yeah, I would like actually to ask Paul whether he managed throughout his visit to Homs to visit the other neighborhoods who obviously have a completely different story to say and other grievances than the ones that he visited in Bab Amr. Did he ever meet any of those people and try to compare all the situation on the ground?
No, and I should stress that we saw a very narrow view of what's going on in Syria. Homs is perhaps the most divided city in the country, as well as being the hub of the revolution, and it is divided along sectarian lines. It wasn't even safe for us to move from one Sunni majority neighbourhood to another, from Bab Amr, say, to Haldia, because of things like the snipers who killed the man who went to get the bread. So, as I was saying earlier, there are Christian neighbourhoods, there are Alawite neighbourhoods, and that is where the security forces are based, because, I mean, it's a generalisation, but largely the minorities still support the government, along with a proportion of Sunnis. This is a regime which still has support. It was quite interesting that we went through a town called Qusair on the way, which is another Sunni majority town. We went to the daily mass demonstration there, and there were literally about a dozen Christians there. All the rest were Sunnis. And I think it's probably true to say that most of the Christians in Qusair supported the regime, most of the Sunnis supported the uprising. But it's not a simple picture. You went a few miles outside of Qusair, and there was a 100% Christian village which was with the uprising.
Paul, and I've got a message here from Slavica in Serbia, picking up on a similar issue, really, saying, we know there are lots of Syrians who support Assad, so what are they saying about the situation?
Well, I have to stress that we were doing covert filming and necessarily we're not seeking out official spokesmen, not going to those neighbourhoods where the security forces were present because we'd be arrested, and therefore necessarily we're not speaking to those people who support the regime. But President Assad has lasted as long as he had because he does have support. People are worried if they're part of the Christian or Alawite community about what a Sunni majority would mean. They're worried about revenge and reprisals for some of the things that's happened. And there is too, an element of the Sunni majority, the merchant class, some of the armed forces still, who do support the regime. This is not a simple picture by any means.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. And as you're talking, we're seeing one of the reports which you sent on Wednesday. And those of you watching, if you haven't seen all of Paul's reports from Homs, they're on one single page, which you'll find very easily if you go to bbc.com/news. Well, Slavica in Serbia, thank you for your question. Here's another one for you, Paul Wood in Beirut, from Orlando, who is watching in Mozambique, posting on our Facebook page. What was the reaction of people when they received the news of the China and Russia veto?
Well, where we were, they were extremely bitter about it. They put a lot of hope in that UN resolution, and one old lady in the hospital, she'd been shot in the leg by a sniper, and she said to me that she hoped God would send a great wind to sweep away Russia and China. After that, people just thought it was inexplicable that the UN would not somehow be able to find some form of words to make their situation better. And again, the thing you heard was that people felt they'd been abandoned, they'd lost all hope, they were alone. They realised that nobody was coming to help them.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. A question here from Roger in Lincoln in the UK, who wonders if you ever feared for your life or if you feared being arrested.
I mean, it's not the first time that we've been into Syria in that way. And yes, we certainly feared being arrested. And that was one of the calculations we made about staying. When it looked as if ground troops were coming in, and who knows, that may still happen, it wouldn't have been good for us to have been caught covertly, having entered with people loyal to the Free Army. It wouldn't have been good to have been caught by the ground forces. I went with a cameraman and a medic who had, between them, covered literally, I think, about 30 conflicts, and they both said it was the heaviest shelling they had endured. Like everybody else in that part of Homs, just one unlucky left or right turn on the streets, and we might have been hit by mortar fire or sniper fire. There were times when, frankly, we were very scared.
I'm sure you were. Paul, we've had calls so far from Ghana, the Palestinian territories, Nigeria, India, Cyprus, Singapore, Egypt and Kyrgyzstan, just to mention some of the countries where people watching BBC World News are getting in touch. And we are live, so if you would like to put a question to Paul Wood, you can either tweet him using the WHYS hashtag, email worldhaveyoursay@bbc.com or facebook.com/worldhaveyoursay. You'll see all the details on the screen. Let's bring in Rafif, who is involved with the activists in Syria, though based in Washington, D.C. Rafif, what would you like to ask Paul?
First, I'd like to thank him for covering Syria and essentially risking his life to expose the facts. My question is to Paul. Are the people in Homs looking at the Free Syrian Army as a protective force or as a liberating one?
I mean, that's a very good question, and it was one I put a lot to Free Army commanders, both in Homs and outside, because the classic pattern of any guerrilla conflict, and I've covered quite a few of them, say in Kosovo, is that a lightly armed guerrilla force attacks a fixed position, say a government base, and the government forces hit back, and it is civilians who suffer. And it was interesting that we followed an action carried out by the Free Army in Qusair. They attacked a base early in the morning, eventually were pushed back because they had only Kalashnikovs against heavy weapons. And one man came out of his house in the nearby village, hysterical with fear and rage, saying that he supported the revolution, but he said, if you're going to attack the base, then attack it and destroy it, because it's still there, and they're going to come into this village, and we'll be the ones who pay the price. I think within Homs, within Bab Amma, where I was staying, it's a little different. Most of the Free Army people have deserted from the regular force and have gone back to their families in Bab Amma. And the posture there, and it's one I think that the people agree with, is very much that they are protecting people. when they do go on the offensive, it is to take out or try to take out, say, government sniper positions in nearby buildings that are already firing at people. So when you ask Free Army commanders, aren't you causing some of this? They say, well, our people are already being killed. We have to do something. And yes, the government hits back, but they can't get at us, and they hit back to deliberately kill civilians in order to try and suppress our activities. But there's a kind of grim determination now on both the part of the civilians and the Free Army fighters. They're going to press this through really until the end, until victory or death, as they say. They're not backing down.
Rafif, thanks for your question, and Paul, thank you for your answer. As you were talking, Paul, we can see some of the great deal of footage that Syrians are uploading onto the internet. We can't verify that footage, but it does appear to be taken in Syria today. I can see more comments and questions coming in from South Sudan, Italy, Pakistan and Lithuania. First, though, let's bring up this question from Harvey in Kentucky in the States, who posts on Facebook, does Paul think that Syria is already in a civil war?
Well, certainly it is in places like Homs or Idlib or the suburbs of Damascus, but it's a big country and the picture varies depending on where you go. I mean, the worry, of course, is that Homs today is the picture of Syria tomorrow, and whether it's a civil war between simply government supporters and the opposition, or it becomes a sectarian civil war between Sunnis, Christians, Alawites and Shiites. I think that is the constant danger, and that's the dilemma for the outside world about whether to intervene. If they say arm the Free Army, arm the rebels, does that make a civil war inevitable? But if they don't do that and it drags on for longer, will this kind of thing happen anyway, and is it better to finish it quickly? These are the kind of policy debates, I think, which are happening now in London and Washington and other capitals.
And Paul, with the activists and the Free Syria Army members that you were with, did you sense an appetite to fight back or simply to defend themselves? I think a lot of our viewers are comparing the way the rebels behaved when they pushed west from Benghazi to Tripoli in Libya. Is there an appetite to do something similar in Syria?
Well, first of all, we're talking about the Free Army as if it's one coherent body. It's almost, if you like, an address that people use when they desert. They go over to the other side, to an area that's loyal to the uprising, and they say, well, now I'm in the Free Army. And there is, despite the presence of a military council in Turkey, really no coherent command and control. We got over the border from Lebanon and found ourselves dealing with two rival Free Army groups in and around Qusair that weren't really talking to one another. So there's the stated policy you get from people in Turkey, and there's what's happening on the ground. Now, the stated policy is that it's a purely defensive force. It is there, for instance, to protect the demonstrations. It is not there to wage a guerrilla war. I think the logic of the conflict is evolving such that you start off protecting demonstrators, then you hit the checkpoint at the end of the road that is firing on those demonstrators, then you hit the sniper position in the high building, and suddenly you are in exactly that, a guerrilla war. And we saw in Qusair an attack. I counted 60 fighters. They claimed it was 100 fighters. That is a pretty big attack, and that is a conflict. And whatever the stated doctrine, essentially they are waging a guerrilla war. And as to their willingness to do that, absolutely. I mean, a lot of them would like to, in their words, martyr themselves. I mean, we saw some incredibly brave, some would say foolhardy actions by them going into, I mean, they're going into battle armed with Kalashnikovs against heavy weapons and tanks.
Paul, many thanks for giving us so much time today on World Have Your Say. There's the BBC's Paul Adams bringing us up to date on Paul Wood. I apologise, Paul, bringing us right up to date with what he saw in Homs. Thank you to all of you who phoned in and emailed in with questions. I apologise if we didn't get to all of yours, but I'm sure you appreciated the answers that Paul did have time to give us. After the news, we're going to discuss the issue that won't go away, which is how the world should react to what's happening in Syria. If you do want to post, facebook.com/worldhaveyoursay, or call us up on the number you'll see on the screen. I'm Ros Atkins. Welcome to World Have Your Say. Well, on this week, we're discussing the issue that just won't go away, and that is how the international community should react to the ongoing difficulties in Syria. All week long, the majority of you getting in touch with the BBC have vilified China and Russia for vetoing that resolution at the UN Security Council. But Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, says, hold on, we should apply the same rules to the government and to the opposition in Syria, while others say no, the focus must must be President al-Assad. Well, wherever you're watching and wherever you're from, we're live here on BBC World News. Your contributions are welcome. All of our guests are live too, so if you want to speak to them, call us up on the number on the screen. You can also get involved online at facebook.com/worldhaveyoursay. Well, as I was saying in the news there, we've had 2 bomb attacks in Aleppo, Syria's second largest city. Let's speak to George, who's on the phone from there. George, tell us about what you've seen and heard today.
Today we woke up at 9 a.m. Two horrible explosions. It was far away from my home, but the sound was so clear. Now there is insecure in the town. There is cars shooting people in the street, innocent people. Lots of kids and civilians are dead. All that because of Free Syrian Army.
So you blame the Free Syrian Army, even though it denies carrying out the attacks.
Yeah, but sir, they speak about those explosions the night before and last week on their pages on the Facebook.
And George, let me ask you, and as you're talking, we're seeing pictures from Syrian state TV of the situation in Aleppo. What's your view of President Assad? Do you think he's the right man to lead Syria?
For now, for this crisis, yeah. Bashar Assad is the right man to lead Syria. We live in peace for more than 10 years. Then the opposition came up, and all the assassinations and the killing and blowing up the oil lines and the streets are begun since the last year.
George, thank you very much indeed. Speaking to us live from Aleppo, saying he was woken up by those 2 explosions, that Bashar al-Assad is the right man to lead Syria at the moment, and he holds the Free Syria Army responsible for those attacks, even though the FSA says they had nothing to do with it. George, thank you for your time today. If you're watching wherever you are and you want to help us report and discuss this story, country code 44 2070 83 72 72 is the number. Now, let me introduce you to 3 of our guests. Amar Wakaf is live with us from London. He's a Syrian based in the south of England. Rafif Shwejati is in Washington, D.C. She works in conjunction with some activists in Homs. And Iyad al-Baghdadi is a blogger and entrepreneur in Dubai. All 3 of you, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Iyad, let me ask you first. That UN resolution was not passed, so what now should the Arab world try and do?
Well, it's an interesting question, because a while ago we were actually brainstorming on Twitter. We had a Twitter discussion, and we were brainstorming the possible scenarios of what might happen in Syria. And eventually, actually, we brainstormed 6 possible scenarios, and they all come down to one of 3 paths. So the first path was actually enough pressure is put on the regime to deal. I mean, it won't be perfect. I mean, let's say the Yemeni model, it won't be perfect, but it'll be better than a civil war. Path number 2 was intervention. Path number 3 is civil war. And I feel that what happened with this veto is that, the UN, flawed as it is, it might have been able to force a deal and, move it away from intervention or civil war. But it seems to us now that militarization is the only way left now. I mean, with Russia and China blocking it, we end up with just civil war. That's the only option right now. And that's why we're so bitter about it. We don't want it to get that far, but it seems that we're already past that point.
So there are various options there. Rafif, let's bring you in, and Imam as well. Rafif first, though. What do you make of those options?
I think those are right on. Unfortunately, the Assad regime has actually internationalized this issue by escalating violence against civilians. Russia and China's veto actually represent foreign intervention already. So certainly we hope that Assad will just step down voluntarily. My hope is that the international community will succeed in making the Assad regime an international pariah.
Amr?
Right, well, I think basically there are a few misconceptions here that I believe are pretty much dictating the situation on the international scene and forcing the international community not to behave in the correct way. First of all, I don't think the Syrian government is pretty much occupied with shooting at civilians. There are now, these days, even quite a few demonstrations that go uninterrupted. The Syrian government is pretty much only interested in places where law and order needs to be restored, and that usually is where military presence by the militants is there. Second, a very important point is that usually the reason why Aleppo and Damascus are, we are explained that Aleppo and Damascus are not participating into this, is that because they are merchant class who benefited from the regime and so on and so forth. I believe that there is a wider issue of identity here. I think there are a lot of Syrians, and I think they are the majority of Syrians, who do not want Syria to turn into a sort of religious-based state. And that's why a clear majority still stays with President Assad. Now, with regards to the options, I clearly hope that the international community would come to their senses and follow the lead, actually, of Russia and try to intermediate between the government and the opposition forces. And Madame Rafif over there in Washington, she's a representative of the coordination committees. I think those people have presence on the ground, and everybody knows now that due to natural causes, the regime is not going to go away. Now, the option is either to engage with the regime and try to come out with a sort of solution that engages everybody else as well and bring in different stakeholders.
Well, okay, let me interrupt you and let's explore that option. As we're talking, we can see pictures there that have been uploaded on the net from Homs. We're not able to verify them, but we believe they were taken in Homs earlier. And Rafif and Iyad, let's explore that. Do you think it is appropriate for whichever party it might be, Russia, the US, the Arab League, to approach President Assad and say, we want to engage with you, we want to find a solution which still involves you? Iyad, does that option appeal?
It just seems too late right now. It seems to me that, when people ask for reform, the regime ignores them. When they ask for the regime out, they kill them. And then when they want you dead, you ask for talks. It's just way too late for that right now.
Rafif?
And if I could jump in, yeah, absolutely. Reforms would have been nice 11 years ago. Dialogue would have been wonderful 11 months ago. Today, when we're looking at 8,000 civilians dead, 100,000 in illegal detention, and some 40,000 forcibly disappeared, to call for dialogue is laughable. If Assad wants to put an end to the opposition, he should just step down.
Well, all three of you, thank you very much for your comments. Don't go anywhere. We will be coming back to you. I can see that Batik, commenting on bbcarabic.com, says we need to eliminate the terrorists with an iron fist. And I think by that he means the activists. And I'll remind you, these two attacks in Aleppo, well, some people are saying it's the work of the government, others saying it's the work of the Free Syria Army. Here at the BBC, we're not able to say either way. Callum in New Zealand says, how can you be certain the government is behind these attacks? Have you actually witnessed soldiers doing it? And Matt in Melbourne, and this is echoed by a number of comments coming into us, says, unless the US, UK and the UN are prepared to condemn the Israeli regime, they shouldn't lecture Syria. Well, we've also had a statement from King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia. He said this to the press earlier: the veto against the Syrian resolution shakes world confidence in the UN. Well, we can respond to that with our guests in a little while. But first of all, let's take a break here for a couple of minutes on BBC. Actually, no, we can carry on that. Well, I'll put that point to Amar. What do you think? Do you think this undermines your view of the UN, the fact that was vetoed?
To the contrary, actually. I mean, we've asked for some balance in the UN Security Council for like decades now, in terms of other issues like the Palestinian issue, as this never happened. And now, again, people are rushing to take the moral high ground here. And I think what Russia and China have done is to sensibly feel that any international intervention, just like what happened in Libya, would lead to far more, actually multiple numbers of deaths. I do question the numbers that Rafif just brought in, but actually only a little bit. But people do not know actually that a lot of the civilians who were killed are actually pro-government supporters as well, who were killed by armed groups. And I lost a relative in Homs, mind you, a few weeks back in the same mortar shell that killed the French journalist Gilles Jacquier, and I visited Homs on the 1st of January, and I did hear horrible stories as well. So people believe that it is basically troops, government troops, shooting a civilian protest in the street, but that is hardly the case anymore in Syria at the moment, actually.
Let's keep on talking about the UN, and I'm interested to hear from those of you watching whether this whole matter has shaken your faith in the UN, as King Abdullah says. I saw William Hague, the British Foreign Secretary, saying diplomacy are the tools that we have. We have to work with them, even if at times it's tough going. Well, thank you very much for your comments. I promised you a break a couple of minutes ago. We actually can go to one now. Hi, I'm Ros Atkins. Thanks for joining me here on the BBC's World Have Your Say. We're discussing how the world should react to what's happening in Syria. Lots and lots of you are phoning up. Let's cross to Jill McGivering with the World Have Your Say team to hear more of the comments you're calling in.
We're getting calls from Iraq, Australia, Denmark and Zambia. And this whole issue of international intervention is something people are very much focused on, although opinion is very much divided. Some people clearly are frustrated that there isn't more international engagement and they're calling for more. Colin in Nigeria has just called to say Russia and China should be held responsible for the situation. He described the situation as a bloodbath. Others focus on the need for a regional response to the crisis, a way of the region trying to sort out its own problems. Jordan in Singapore was typical. He said, is foreign intervention really the solution, or could the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Arab League perhaps play a leading role? And there are also people who don't want the rest of the world to get involved at all, who basically say they will just do more harm than good and complicate the situation. Rajesh in India was one of those who called in. He said the United States is causing some of these problems in Syria. They're meddling in Syria's internal affairs. And finally, picking up on some of Paul's comments just before the half-past break when he was talking about the issue of civil war, Yehal commented earlier in a discussion with BBC Arabic saying, like Libya before it, Syria has now entered a civil war.
Jill, many thanks. And those of you watching, if you want to listen to the radio edition of World Have Your Say, Jill will be hosting that in a couple of hours' time. Listen through bbcworldservice.com. James in Kyrgyzstan's just phoned to say, I'm ashamed no one has put a stop to this. And here's an idea perhaps we could explore with our guests, Amar in London, we've got Rafif in Washington, and also Evgeny joining us again from Moscow. Evgeny, here's a message from Mubasher in UAE, who says the Western world should deliver arms to Syrian protesters so they can defend themselves. Would that be something you would support?
Yeah, with this word, maybe I can support it. What I want is just to stop the blood which is happening currently in Syria, and I think that's the most important thing, to stop killing of civilian people. That's really important. But at the same time, you know, I found a really interesting comment here on blogs on Daily Telegraph that some guy, Adrian, he's writing, there are snipers in Syria shooting civilians in Assad is being blamed. So, and these snipers are being brought by Western backing to destabilize Syria and demonize Assad. That's what he's writing.
So some cynicism there. Evgeny, thank you very much. And as you're talking, we can see President Assad meeting with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, earlier in the week. Rafif and Amar, let's hear you talk about this. Perhaps Rafif first. Actually, hold your thought, Rafif, because we've managed to get in touch with Mahmoud in Homs. For the last hour, World Have Your Say's producers have been trying to make connections with people there. We've managed to do that. Mahmoud, tell us what's happening in your city today. That's a shame. That line is deteriorating. Let's try and clear it up, and we will go back to you if we can. Rafif, I was asking if you would approve of the Free Syrian Army being given arms by the West.
Well, I would hope things wouldn't get to that. You know, we really wanted this to be a civil resistance movement. We were hoping that Bashar al-Assad would have the maturity and leadership to step down. Unfortunately, he has internationalized this. I think the immediate requirement is humanitarian relief. As Paul Brown reported just a little while ago, people are getting shot by snipers simply for delivering bread. So we are probably looking at mass starvation. We're certainly looking at an absolute shortage of medical supplies for all these people who have been wounded by regime forces. So I think our first priority needs to be some mechanism to deliver relief to the civilian population.
And what about you, Amar? Would you support that?
What support what, sorry?
Giving guns, giving arms to the rebels.
Well, I think people need to understand what the Free Syrian Army is. Since the start of these problems, actually, there have been armed groups. The army was attacked in Banyas by some armed groups pretty much early on. In Nawa, in Saida, the army officers. So there was this, militant movement. Nowadays, these old people, all these groups, are being joined under the umbrella of the Free Syrian Army, which is supposed to have been formed by some army members who refuse to shoot at civilians, and this is what people try to promote it with. But actually, I don't think that the entire Syrian army of like 500,000 people are all bad guys, and only a few tens of officers and individuals have the free blood in them. I think some people usually defect the army for all sorts of reasons, and those people, if we give them arms, we're complicating the matter worse, actually. What people do not realize is the level of support that President Assad actually has still, even after all these months into the crisis.
Okay, so you're warning that this could complicate matters further. Time's up at the moment for this edition of World Have Your Say. Perhaps we can explore this on World Have Your Say Extra, which is live on BBC World News Television in 3.5 hours' time. Or if you just can't wait until then, go straight on to facebook.com/World Have Your Say, where you can join in that discussion right away. To Amar in London, Rafif in Washington, D.C. and Evgeny in Moscow, thank you very much indeed. And Mahmoud in Homs, I'm afraid we didn't manage to clear up that line, which was a shame, but of course we'll keep trying for other editions of World Have Your Say. Thanks to all of you for watching and contributing. I'll speak to you soon. Goodbye.